there needs to be a sense of trust, especially with companies and organizations. I think as the social climate has continued to evolve, there's a distrust that's come up with between humans and organizations. So, there's a uprising in folks who don't want to partner with organizations that don't stand behind diversity, equity, and inclusion. Or, there's been individuals who stop purchasing things or using services because of things that the company has come out and said against, human rights or rights of those who represent diverse communities. So I think, when we talk about it from this human landscape, people, you have to, it always reminds me of the Maya Angelou quote where she says, people will forget the things that you said, but they'll never forget the way you make them feel. And it's so important because as I get older, that rings through true in almost every interaction, right? Like, it's hard sometimes to put ourselves into the shoes of someone who's having a different experience than our own. And I think that that's where the emotional intelligence and kind of empathy comes into play. And that's not always a skill that people are naturally born with. So to some extent, it has to be taught. And it's a skill that takes time. Again, just because as adults, it's a lot harder for us to learn things and change behaviors. It may seem like it's challenging, but it's not impossible as long as we stay committed and take the time to really understand one another.
All right, guys, welcome back to a brand new episode of the HR Heroes podcast. I'm incredibly excited because I have Chanel Brooks with me here today. Chanel, welcome to the conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So I like to start off these conversations by asking you a question. How is your heart doing today?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Honestly, I think my heart is feeling really full. I think, now that we're coming up on a holiday weekend, it gives me an opportunity to take a breather and relax, and then also spend some time with family, which I think is so important. So looking forward to kicking back, enjoying the weather, and maybe having a little barbecue for Memorial Day weekend.
Well, that sounds like an amazing plan. I love that. So one of the things that we like to do as we kind of get our episodes kicked off here is we like to bridge our episodes by asking or posing a question that was asked by our previous guest. So the question comes from our previous guest, and their question was, can you teach me about your focus of work or profession, and what would it be? All right, let me restart that. I'm going to do that over. Okay, here we go. All right. So what we'd like to do here is bridge our last episode together by asking a question that was posed by our previous guest. And their question is, can you teach me something about your focus of work or profession? And what would it be in the next 2 minutes?
Yeah, I would say the short version is in my job, I teach people how to be better humans, and give back to the communities that we all live in and support.
I love that. One of the things that I want to kind of dive into is your focus of DE&I. I want to ask you a question. What's wrong with the world of DE&I today? And why do you feel like so many organizations are having such a tough time embodying what being a good human looks like?
So it's such an interesting question because I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that there's just a lot of people who've grown accustomed to seeing the world in their particular point of view. And psychologically speaking, as we get older, it's harder and harder to break those habits and kind of shift your thinking. So I think that if it feels wrong right now, it's largely because that experience is coming to the surface, where there's a lot of people who are expected to adapt to rapid change, because thanks to technology, the world is moving at a much faster pace. And as a result, there's a lot of folks who are it's a hard learning curve, as I like to call it. So there's just an opportunity to really hone in on the ways that we meet people where they are to bridge those gaps in knowledge and understanding.
And one of the biggest things that I think we should focus on kind of at the start of our episode here is the business strategy of meeting people where they are. Why is that so important? And why do you think it's such an emphasis in the environment of work today?
I think it's because, number one, I think the world, the work, well, let me start again. I think that there's a lot of overlap now in the external experience of individuals and the workplace. So a lot of employees are now bringing the heaviness of what's going on outside of work, including, the social climate, the political climate, a lot of inequities that are existing in various communities, a lot of racism, discrimination. Some of those things are now trickling into the workforce. And I think that some organizations are struggling with figuring out how to address that with their employees while also being mindful of their business. But I think it's critical because if your employees are happy, then your business will succeed, right? So it's important for people to come into the workplace and feel like their voices are heard and their thoughts and considerations are being valued. But then also they want to know to some extent that the company understands their lived experience, and is willing to provide them resources and tools that they need to succeed both in and outside of the workplace.
Yeah, I just think it's an interesting time to kind of be a human being, if you will, because ever since the pandemic, it seems like our professional lives and our personal lives have kind of blended together, and the expectations that we have in our personal lives have bled into what we expect at work. Why do you think so many organizations are, from a leadership perspective, kind of having a tough time adjusting to that new blended expectation that so many people have?
That's a good question. I mean, I think to some extent it goes back to just that education and awareness, right? Like it's hard sometimes to put ourselves into the shoes of someone who's having a different experience than our own. And I think that that's where the emotional intelligence and kind of empathy comes into play. And that's not always a skill that people are naturally born with. So to some extent, it has to be taught. And it's a skill that takes time. Again, just because as adults, it's a lot harder for us to learn things and change behaviors, but it's not impossible. I think that that's the point that needs to be made, is that this may seem like a long road, it may seem like it's challenging, but it's not impossible as long as we stay committed, and take the time to really understand one another.
So I would like to kind of dive into your, I would say, initial organic experiences and working in the space of DE&I. Because when we've previously talked, you said, I was doing DE&I work when I was in school and I just didn't even notice. So why don't you kind of talk
Mhm.
about your early journey and experience and kind of realizing that this was something important, but you were also being a practitioner before it even came to your attention?
Yeah, I mean, I was in undergrad, so, young 18, 19, 21 year old, without a clue, but I knew that my passion was always in developing others and giving back to those who needed support, and almost being like the person that I wish that I had when I was growing up, right? Like somebody who took a vested interest, and wanted to see me flourish and things like that. So I wanted to be able to give that back in some way. And when I was in undergrad, luckily I went to a school where the opportunities were endless. So I immediately got involved in like student government. By the time I was in my senior year, I was the president. So I had a really firm understanding of the cultural landscape at the school, which helped to broaden my horizons and see different perspectives. But then it also gave me the operational skills, right? So I was able to manage all 20 plus student run organizations. I was able to work with our student affairs team. I spent some time working in the bursar's office, which, for those who aren't familiar, is essentially like financial aid and like the people you pay your college tuition to. So it also gave me another perspective from a finance lens, the inequities that existed by diverse communities. So, a large population of the student body at my school were from underrepresented communities. So I think it really gave me like firsthand insight into some of the challenges that exist, some of which, weren't a part of my lived experience. So I think I learned a lot. And I think that that's what helped me really hone in on what I wanted my career to be post graduation.
What about post graduation? What were some of those early experiences that you had kind of getting out into the world? Because I know that you had a passion for education as well. And maybe, we realized at some point in time that educating the future is not kind of our strong suit. So why don't you kind of talk about that early journey and kind of your pivotal moments and kind of choosing to correct path, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because one of the things that I love most about working in diversity, equity, and inclusion is talking to other practitioners and hearing how they ended up working in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm sure you probably experienced this to some extent, but you talk to a lot of people and it's very different pathways, right? Like some started in like as nurses, some people started as teachers, some people started, working in HR and then kind of grew into this diversity, equity, and inclusion role. So for me, it was the teaching pathway. Again, I wanted to give back to folks in a meaningful way. I find it rewarding to be able to partner with students and help them develop and reach their potential, but also be their cheerleader. Like that was the most exciting part, is like, it would be the little things that were like, yes, you did it. And like, you should feel proud, and like instilling that confidence in them. And it's really cool because now in my role as a diversity, equity, and inclusion manager, like I get to do some of the same things. It has a little bit of a different feel, of course, because now it's with adults, but you can tell that it's still equally as rewarding for both of us, for them to have a new understanding, whether that's around someone else's lived experience, or for them, opening their minds to just see things a different way. And that still makes the work just so rewarding.
I mean, I feel like that's so beautiful. And my question for you is, do we ever truly grow up, or do we always stay those kids and we're just in an adult body? You know what I mean?
Yeah, honestly, I don't think we do. I think we just get weighed down by the responsibilities of adulthood. But like at the core, like we all love like sitting and watching cartoons, or like spending the day doing nothing but eating junk food and so on and so forth. So I think at the core, we still are kids, which is also what makes it a lot easier to tap into, individuals, right? Like you tap into those things that may be a common space, and then kind of just build from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting experience because the older and older I get, the more I realize that I still feel like a young kid, but my experiences and I guess responsibilities that weigh on me are just a little bit heavier. And that's the kind of the aches and the pains that I feel, if that makes a little sense. One of
Yeah.
the things that we talk about a lot on the podcast is kind of the aches and pains of initiatives. And I know over the last couple of years, DE&I has become incredibly popular from the optics of an organization, but it seems like a lot of
Mhm.
organizations have a really tough time integrating the practice into the overall business strategy, if you will. So I want to kind of give you the opportunity to share what are the key focus areas of effective DE&I integration, if you will, into a business and business culture.
Well, I think the most important is getting leadership buy-in, right? If the leaders at the top of the house aren't invested in the commitment of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or having an understanding of the inequities that exist across multiple communities, I think that it always presents a bit more of a challenge into integrating that in. I think it's also important to ensure that there's some sort of audit or assessment of current practices, because a lot of times organizations get misled in thinking that they are being inclusive, or they are, providing equitable opportunities. And then you look at their pay scales and it's like, well, there's a discrepancy here based off of how much women are being paid versus how much men are being paid, or how much diverse women or women of color are being paid versus women who are not women of color. So I think that there's definitely an opportunity to make sure that that information is consolidated, and that also feeds into that leadership buy-in, because people can say a lot of things, but the numbers and the data don't lie. So a lot of times when you spend the time to get the audit information, it gives you an opportunity to really sit back and reflect and say like, oh wow, like here it is, we thought we were doing so incredible, and here's why we may be having challenges with recruiting diverse talent, or attracting diverse talent, or retaining diverse talent. So those are the two that I would say is most important. But then I think the third part from a workforce perspective is taking the time to build out an effective communication plan that highlights the why, right? So when we talk about shifting things, or when we talk about like corporate culture as a whole, right? Like there's this idea that there's information that gets disseminated from the top down, and everyone in the organization is just expected to implement. And I think when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's a little bit more nuanced, because it's about the human experience. So it's important to include language, or create a change management and communication plan that includes, the why. Like, why are we doing this? What's the value for me as an employee? Why should I care about this? And why is it important in the workplace? So those are the top three, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I had an individual on the podcast named Dr. Loran Starr, and she is the nation's only PhD in DE&I. And she brought up an interesting perspective on some of the challenges that DE&I initiatives face, and one of which is starting at the top. She mentioned that there needs to be an accountability measure tied to leadership and even compensation or bonuses or something like that to make sure that they are embodying and actually, I would say, infusing the initiative into the work that they do. So, what do you kind of think about those accountability measures, if you will, for leaders of organizations to make sure they're actually walking the walk and not just talking the talk?
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly. I think that accountability is super important, specifically when we talk about long term change, right? Like, I think the current climate is a lot of organizations are coming down off of the 2020 civil unrest and, the death and murder of George Floyd. And, now a lot of organizations are kind of taking a step back to say, like, oh, well, we did what we needed to do. And it's like, no, this is a long game, right? Like, the inequities don't stop existing just because time has passed, right? Like, these are still experiences of underrepresented communities, and it shows up in those employees when they come to the workplace. So the accountability, I think, is super important. Number one, because it almost forces some leaders to pay attention and to invest in what's being done. And then as long as you have a DEI practitioner that's able to articulate the way in which you integrate those practices into the organization and almost kind of like, show them the way, I think, you'll start to see more consistent change, more meaningful change. So I agree 100%. Accountability across the board is always best practice.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about kind of the articulation, if you will, because I know in our previous conversation we touched on that topic, and it's really got my mind kind of buzzing about how do we appropriately articulate the importance of these initiatives, especially to leaders? And why do you think there's kind of like a shortfall, if you will, in kind of the ability to articulate appropriately? Is it the business language? Is it the language we use, talking about the overall impact of these initiatives? Or what's kind of your 2 cents on the importance of articulating and maybe why so many people can't do it as well as they should be doing it?
Yeah, I think sometimes going back to my earlier response is a lack of data to back it up, right? Like, in my
Hmm.
experience in presenting for executives on any given topic, DEI, or outside of that, they want to know like the who, what, when, where, why, right? And then they also want that to be backed up by facts. So if you don't have the facts, like, it's going to be a little bit harder to convince a lot of those audiences why this is meaningful change. And I think the other piece is a lot of times we don't spend enough time learning about the way that we can infuse or integrate the practices into the existing business landscape. So sometimes that's just a general lack of knowledge. And then other times it's simply just because the expertise around integration is missing. So a lot of DEI practitioners sometimes take a route of, we're just going to do this blanket framework, without taking the time to really understand the landscape of the organization, because it's really not a one size fits all. While the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion may be similar, the way that that's integrated across different organizations will vary based off of the mission and vision of that organization, the current state of that organization, as well as, the people who are in leadership roles.
Let's talk about some of the ways in which we can integrate these initiatives into the culture of an organization, because I really want to provide as much detail as possible and I would say value for the audience who's listening. So let's kind of dive into some ways in which we can integrate or the appropriate approach to integrate these initiatives into the overall culture, into different initiatives of the actual team and the organization as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of ways based off of, the HR strategy of the organization. I think where it's most prevalent is in the employee experience. So when we talk about the full employee life cycle, everything from recruitment and attraction to onboarding to performance management, and that retention, those are all pivotal steps in integrating DEI practices. So when we talk about it from an attraction and recruitment perspective, where are we sourcing talent from? Are we looking at places or working with organizations that have diverse slates that can be presented, for roles at different levels through the organization? And then the other piece is, how are we developing our internal talent? Like, as we transition into the performance management piece, we don't always have to look externally for diverse talent. So is there an opportunity to create some upskilling programs or mentorship and sponsorship programs that are open to those who are from underrepresented communities? And do we pipeline them to participate in those programs? Do we ensure that the participants are equitable, right? Do we have representation from all of those diverse groups to ensure that the opportunity for professional development is available to everyone? Are we thinking about, as we create create, these professional development programs? Are we thinking about the inequities, the systematic inequities that exist in different communities that may present certain participants at a disadvantage? Are we thinking about ways that we can bridge that gap as we build a framework for the program? Because again, that knowledge is super important to be able to build a program that has the impact that we're looking for. If the objective is to, increase representation, let's say at senior levels, it's important to not only pay attention to where we're sourcing and recruiting talent from, but then also taking a look at our internal diversity to say, like, do we have the representation that we can even put into a pipeline? And if we don't, why not? Is anybody asking that question? And I know that that's, again, nuanced across different organizations, but it's important. It's an important part of the discussion. So I could talk about the integration piece all day, but I know that the representation and recruitment is always top of the list for a lot of organizations. So I think that those are some of the considerations that should always be taken into account.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's on the front of my mind as we're talking about recruitment is a lot of organizations are looking to, I would say, supercharge the recruitment through the tools and use of things like AI, as an example.
Mhm.
But we also have to recognize that there is a natural bias that comes with some of this technology because of the people who developed it in the first place. Because
Mhm.
often from underestimated communities, those are not stakeholders in developing a lot of these systems. So, do you have any hesitancies about the use of technology from a decision-making perspective about recruitment and how we get people into our organization if we're relying strictly on technology that was developed by a certain demographic of our society?
Yeah, I think you hit it spot on. Like, there's definitely cause for concern. I think if organizations are electing to take that route, it should be coupled with some sort of development training around how to think or be a thought leader, or going back to my earlier point, like teaching them that emotional intelligence, that empathy piece. Because if you're not going into it, like, technology can be great, but if you don't have the critical thinking skills to understand the way to leverage that technology tool, it ends up doing more damage than it does benefit. So I think that that's the balancing act. Is like, it's one thing to say we're just going to do this, we're just going to launch this platform, but it's a whole other thing to ensure that your recruitment teams feel comfortable and understand the value of mitigating bias in that process. And one of the things that I'm really proud of is the fact that I've been able to work with a couple of organizations to really create bias training specifically for the recruitment team, so that they have a better understanding of the ways in which it shows up in their behavior, but also in some of these evolving technology platforms that are coming out. So it's already a second thought. So now the hope is that as people go into these conversations or they're reviewing resumes, they're thinking about those things before they just make a snap decision based off of preconceived notions.
Have you had some enlightening experiences, is the word that I'll use, when it comes to helping people identify some of those biases that they might have but not even notice? Can you share like a story of maybe an experience you've had of going in and doing some of this training and helping people kind of, I would say, open up their perspective to some of the things that they don't even maybe aware of when it comes to bias and kind of how they're looking at candidates and stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I can share quite a few examples. I think one that came up the most was, one of my employers. We were looking for well, it actually comes up quite a bit when it comes to how we look at veteran talent. So, a lot of times those who are transitioning from active duty, they come back into the workforce. And it's, again, one of those nuanced experiences of trying to figure out, like, what are my transferable skills? Like, I was in the military for X amount of years and, like, I did this one specific thing, but I don't necessarily know how that translates into a corporate environment. And sometimes when I've worked with recruiters, they've looked at the resumes of veterans and they said, oh, well, they don't have this specific experience, so they can't qualify for this role. And it's like, well, how can we make that assumption when, number one, they came from the military and they have, time management skills, or, they have a significant knowledge, like they pick up on information quickly. Like, those are the type of skills that I try to pay attention to anytime that I've been in a hiring manager position. Is like, okay, so maybe they don't have line for line the skills that we're looking for, but is there an opportunity? Do they have potential? Do they have transferable skills that will still make them successful in this role, as long as they have the support of our leadership, as well as, those resources that can help them better learn the job. Because it's not always so much about like the skills that they bring to the table. Sometimes it's about like, is there a potential to coach them up? And I don't necessarily know that we should disqualify a whole demographic of people just because they may not have, one specific skill set or taken the traditional path to get into, a senior level or management role.
I mean, don't we think that that's kind of where the future of work is going to be lying? Let's say in the next like 5 to 7 years, with more and more people kind of, I would say, moving away from the traditional education path. I get really worried about an old school mindset when it comes to recruitment and talent acquisition, because a lot of people have an incredible amount of lived experience today that isn't proven on a resume, as an example, or you're, proficient at Excel. And so how do you kind of think the future needs to be positioned from a mindset of we need to hire for the hungry people who are willing to learn, instead of looking for those individuals who just fit into the box of a resume?
Yeah, I think it's really just having transparent conversations, right? Like I think a lot of times, it's easy for us to go with the status quo and say like, well, this is the way it's always been done. And again, tying it back to that, what's in it for me is like, okay, so this is the way it's always been done. But like, we also are branding ourselves as an organization that's like a top employer for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or, you know, priding ourselves on having this inclusive culture. But then that also ties to the way in which the company brings in revenue. So ultimately, if we keep trending in the direction that we're going and keep doing things the same, we're not, eventually it's going to stall. Eventually we're going to start losing money, because while there are quite a few organizations that are stepping back from diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, there's also a much larger population that are like hunkering down and saying like, we're going to do more, we're going to stay committed. So it's then going to become a conversation of like, it's going to get harder and harder for us to attract any talent because of the way in which the world is continuing to evolve. So it's only going to benefit us to adapt to that evolution, so that we can really drive a transformative workplace.
I mean, I think all the things that we're talking about today really have kind of the overall umbrella of being a human-centric individual. In our previous conversation, I think I mentioned there was a previous guest on the podcast and said, Keenan, before there was HR, before there was DE&I, there was human beings who cared. And sometimes we just
Yeah.
need to get back to that first principle of human beings who care. And so one of the questions or things that you brought up a little bit earlier in our conversation was the emphasis of soft skills or emotional intelligence. So why do you think the landscape of business, especially business leadership today, has really started moving towards those soft skills, if you will? Being able to think about empathy, compassion, curiosity, kind candor. Why do you think those things are so important, especially in the world of business these days?
I think it's because it drives everything that you do, right? Like there needs to be a sense of trust, especially with companies and organizations. I think as the social climate has continued to evolve, there's a distrust that's come up with between humans and organizations. So, there's a uprising in folks who don't want to partner with organizations that don't stand behind diversity, equity, and inclusion, or there's been individuals who stop purchasing things or using services because of things that the company has come out and said against, human rights or rights of those who represent diverse communities. So I think, when we talk about it from this human landscape, people, you have to it always reminds me of the Maya Angelou quote, where she says, people will forget the things that you said, but they'll never forget the way you make them feel. And it's so important, because as I get older, that rings through true and true almost every interaction, right? Where it's like, I could say that I'm apologetic, I could say that I'm an ally, I could say all of the things, but if I don't make people feel that in every interaction, then I'm doing them a disservice. And in a work environment, it's the same thing. I think sometimes we just get so caught up in like the rat race of like getting things done and finishing our to-do list, and, getting all of the things checked off our list so that we can meet the business objectives. But we would be much more efficient at that if we took the time to remember those human elements, and we took the time to get to know one another and our unique lived experiences and how those intersect in the workplace, so that we can go much farther faster together.
Why do you feel like so many people are refusing to stick with the status quo? And I guess this is more of like a macro societal question for you. But why do you think so many people are fed up with kind of going along with the ideas and the dogma, if you will, of the past, and saying that the human element isn't, important in the world of business? Why do you think that's kind of been triggered over the last couple of years?
I mean, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I know that I can speak from my own point of view, as well as research that I've done as a DEI practitioner. And I think it's just because people are tired. Like, people are tired of it. It's not working. So, in order for us to progress forward, we have to do something different. Now, that's not to say that every single idea is going to be the right idea, but I think you're never going to know until you actually make the effort to try something different. And I think now we're to a place where people feel more confident in holding and setting boundaries and having uncomfortable conversations, and just speaking up about the things that are just unjust. I think that, again, going back to the human side of it, there's only so much that we can take as human beings, right? So, like, as things continue to happen in our communities and we start to see so many things coming to light, as far as, lives being taken, or injustice and discrimination and exploitation and all of those things, like, it gets to a point where it's like we have to do something. And I think what's really cool about our society now is that people are figuring out ways to do that on their own. Like, they aren't waiting for someone to tell them what to do. They aren't necessarily waiting for their organization to take a stance. They're really, like, trying to mobilize people within their network, their teams, and even speaking up more to their leadership to say, like, hey, like, here's why this is important, not just to me, but to other people like me. So here's, like, a plan of action. How can we implement this? How can we work together? How can we do something different? And I think that from an organization perspective, there's a lot of organizations who are now being more vocal about, like, hey, we realize in the past we haven't done this right, but we want to do better. So, like, how do we do that? And that's where, these organizations that are building out teams are coming in. That's where, they're getting consultant services from experts to really provide them with the framework that they can use. Because in my experience, that's really what's missing, is a lot of people, have the passion, but they don't necessarily know how to implement. They don't know what the roadmap should look like. They don't know what those milestones should look like. So that's where, people like me come in to say, like, okay, great. Like, lucky for you, this is, like, what I live to do. So I can help you with that.
What do you think about when you were talking about, the ability for an organization to say, hey, we didn't get this right, but we're going to change? That sounds like it's grounded in the idea of humility. So how important do
Mhm.
you feel like organizational humility is in the world of being able to say, we didn't do these things right? But it almost sounds like a superpower to be able to have the ability to take a step back and then say, we're going to be better moving forward. What do you kind of think about that idea of humility?
Yeah, I mean, from a personal perspective, I think it speaks volumes, especially because of the current climate. Like, a lot of organizations, because of their stakeholders, aren't necessarily looking to be as vocal. And say we made a mistake, but there are quite a few organizations that have done that or shown it through their efforts. And I think that it's invaluable when we talk about branding, and we talk about longevity, right? Like, that to me feels like future thinking. And for organizations that are willing to take that approach, it really sets them up for success, because it allows them the opportunity to start to build trust with individuals, and attract them. And then it also allows them to build that trust with or reinforce that trust with their existing workforce, because it shows this human side that says, like, we get it. Like, we get the brand of corporations. We get the fact that we may not be doing things right, but we want to do better. And here's how we plan on starting. I think it goes a long way.
Don't you think it's interesting how important reputation has become today? Because when I think about kind of like consumer behavior, we naturally think about what is the reputation of this organization and who is behind maybe some of the missteps that have kind of, I would say, created the bad reputation in the marketplace. Because if
Mhm.
you think about kind of like, and I don't know if this is just like front of mind or it's just like so much more important in today's world, but the brand of your organization is your reputation. And being able to
Mhm.
have a brand that will stand for the right things through time is kind of like a future proofing technology, or I would say technique to be able to attract
Mhm.
talent and also the right people to your organization, but also the right type of customers as well. So isn't that just an
Yep.
interesting time to kind of think about how important reputation is, especially in this world of instant gratification? It almost seems like the inverse of the instant gratification that we look for today is only outweighed by the macro reputation of an organization. That's just so interesting to me.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. And I think it's one of those impacts of technology that we don't necessarily always think about, because I think to your point about this world of instant gratification, technology has also created a platform or a space where you can get information so quickly, so much information at one time, and to be absorbing it in at such a fast pace. There's a lot of input output, and when we think about the way that the brain functions, it's a lot of information to take in, process, and then output with a response. And oftentimes, I think our brains sometimes trick us into going with what the majority is saying. So oftentimes we end up formulating an opinion that may not actually be rooted in fact, but because that's what the masses are saying from our use of technology, we end up going with that and putting a stamp on an organization almost instinctively. Um, Especially because there was already just this pre-existing bias in some situations around like corporate functions. Like, let's be real, like people have
Yeah.
complained about corporations since the beginning of time, and it's just continued to evolve year over year as things have continued to escalate in our society. So I think it's one of those things where we just have to be more mindful of the information that we're soaking in, and being able to be aware enough to check our biases when they present themselves. But I do think that there's a huge lean in on, you know, just tagging companies as good or bad. There's never any in between. And I think, if you were to ask somebody right now, like, what are the top three organizations that you think are doing incredible with diversity, equity, and inclusion? The average person may have some ideas, and they're likely tied to their own personal opinion about their brand.
Yeah, it's a delicate dance because, like you
It
said, the
is.
power of social media is incredibly interesting to me. I was just thinking about while you were talking there, the brand of Jimmy John's. So a couple years, maybe I would say, let's call it a year ago, I had a personal relationship with somebody, and they sent a message to me and they said, "We're not going to Jimmy John's anymore." And I said, "Why?" And they said the CEO of Jimmy John's likes to go hunt tigers and lions in Africa. And because this person loved animals, she was like, "We're not doing anything with that brand anymore." And I thought that was a
Yeah.
really interesting kind of nuance of all of the reputation that Jimmy John has was skewed by this individual's perspective about one simple snippet or clip that they saw on the internet. Is it true? Can't validate it. But their reputation of the entire organization was switched with a simple post or a retweet or whatever it was of a simple nuance of what this person does in their personal time. It's just such an interesting time to think about the delicacy of our social reputation and kind of how people perceive our brands.
And it's funny you mentioned that, because that's a form of bias, right? Like that's
Hmm.
the halo horn effect, where it's like this one thing changes your whole perception of the organization. While, to be honest, sometimes we don't even know it to be true. So one of the things that I've
Yeah.
implemented in my day to day is like, when people come to me and be like, "We're not supporting this organization," or like, "Talk to me about your views on this organization as a DEI practitioner," and I'm like, "Well, now that you laid out the facts for me, like, tell me where you got this information from." And most of the time, believe it or not, there's a ton of people who are getting their news from places like TikTok. So it's like,
Hmm.
again, going back to this influence of technology and social media, it's like, well, are we pausing to actually think about what we're soaking in and what we're consuming? Or are we just looking to make a snap decision because the content that's being presented to us already formulates the opinion for us? So like, those are the critical moments where it's like, this is bias in action. Here's an opportunity for me to mitigate it. So let me think about this before I just make this blanket assumption. And I think that that's the skill that a lot of people need to be taught more, in order to really drive inclusive spaces in and outside of the workplace.
Yeah, it's like a healthy sense of skepticism because I was listening to
Right.
another conversation that I heard the other day, and they talked about Gen Z. Although we might talk about how disadvantaged these kids are and this generation is when it comes to the use of technology, what they've also had to do is create a healthy sense of skepticism about information that they consume. Because when I think about my parents, who are boomers born in the early 60s, they grew up in an environment where the media in itself was a trusted resource. It was a trusted source of information that they could trust because it was fed from the top and we didn't question those things. But now there's so many media outlets that it seems like we almost have to challenge first. Where did this information come from? Is it legitimate? And how can I back check it against other references to make sure that this is actually true? It's a really interesting time to kind of be in society with just so much swirling information around us.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. And sometimes it can create more separation, or sometimes it can bring us closer together. But I think, again, like just taking those moments to pause and like really think through your actual opinion. Like, I think sometimes we as individuals lose sight of that, right? Is like, is this my actual opinion? Like, do I actually feel this strongly about taking this stance? Or is it because I'm just, as a human being, following my psychological innate desire to want to belong or to want to fit in or to not want to
Wow.
challenge the status quo? And I think that that's something that we don't spend enough time talking about. And as we think about the evolution of diversity, equity, and inclusion, psychology, I think personally, is going to play a really big role. Again, tying back to that emotional intelligence, those soft skills, paying attention to the way that we make people feel, but then also taking the time to think about the way in which we show up as individuals, like really checking those biases, paying attention to them, and choosing to make a different decision.
What do we kind of think about from an evolution of DE&I moving in the future? Give me like a high level 5 year kind of anticipation of how you hope the space in itself is going to evolve.
I mean, I'm feeling optimistic as someone who's currently working in the space, because again, there is a desire, right? Like, there's a lot of organizations, there's a lot of individuals, there's a lot of community groups, nonprofits that are really buckling down on their commitment to supporting underserved communities. So I think that there's an opportunity for us to see a transition, especially because I think the other part, while we love our baby boomers, they are phasing out of the workforce. So I think that that'll bring in a whole new regime of leaders who, are from our lovely millennial generation, but they'll be a little bit more receptive and open to new ideas and new ways of doing things, and hopefully encouraging critical thinking skills to really transform the entire DEI landscape. And what I'm hopeful to see is that there's a more formalized integration of diversity, equity, and inclusion into human resources across all corporations.
I think going back to your element of, you used a word very strategically and intentionally today, which is being a practitioner. You have to be a practitioner of these actions and of this cultural element of what we need in our society that bleeds into our work lives as well. And so I just want to kind of say, I really appreciate you for being a practitioner of what is necessary to keep pushing us forward, because it's the daily in and out actions that we do that actually get us closer to our goals of creating this culture that we're all looking for and anticipating in our work lives. I want to use the last couple seconds here to give you a question, or give you an opportunity to pose a question for our next guest. So what do you got for us, Chanel?
All right. So I thought about this, and I'm a naturally curious person. So I always like to just know more about like what drives people. Again, of course, it came up in a couple of my responses, just driving relationships and the value of understanding different lived experiences. So since I know this is a podcast for HR professionals, I would like to know from the next guest, what is the most rewarding part of working in human resources?
I love that. Well, that's an amazing way for us to be able to end the episode today. Once again, Chanel, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's such a blessing to be able to share this virtual table with you, to be able to hear your insights and your predictions, your challenges that you're facing, but also kind of the way forward. And I just want to say, for everybody who's watching and listening today, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
All right. That's a wrap, guys. Catch you in the next one.